All right, get ready, because today we're diving deep into something pretty amazing, DNA data storage.
Yeah.
That's right, storing information digitally, but in DNA molecules, like
Right.
archiving libraries, but in a space like smaller than a grain of rice.
Wow.
You know, I was looking at some articles you sent over on this, so let's unpack it.
Yeah.
Like, how does this even work, and what kind of challenges are we looking at here?
Yeah, it's a field that's really exploding, with potential.
Absolutely.
And the thing that's really got everyone's attention is just how dense DNA can be as storage.
Right.
Think about this, like 1 gram of DNA could hold 215 petabytes of data.
Wow.
And to give you some perspective on that, that's like 220,000 1 terabyte hard drives crammed into something you can barely see.
That's a crazy amount of data. I mean, that's hard to even fathom those numbers.
Yeah.
But how do we get there? How do we go from, ones and zeros to, the language of life?
Right.
Like encoding data in DNA sounds like something out of Star Trek.
It does sound pretty futuristic, but the science behind it is really fascinating.
Okay.
It really comes down to epigenetics, specifically a process called DNA methylation.
Okay.
And you can almost think of your basic DNA sequence as the hardware, and these methylation modifications are like the software, adding another layer of information on top of the genetic code that's already there.
So it's not just the A's, T's, C's, and G's.
Right.
There's a whole other level of information on top of it.
Exactly. Yeah, imagine like a book, right?
Okay.
You've got the words on the page, that's your basic DNA sequence.
Okay.
But then someone comes along and highlights certain phrases or words.
Got it.
Adding their interpretation. That's kind of what DNA methylation does. It's
Right.
like a marker that signifies, there's another layer of information here.
Okay, so like these methylation markers are like switches flipped on or off to represent the ones and zeros of the digital data.
Yeah.
And from what I was reading, researchers have this cool method called movable type printing to write this data onto DNA. What's that all about?
This movable type printing for DNA is a really cool concept.
Okay.
So instead of making DNA strands from scratch,
Yeah.
which takes a lot of time and money,
Right.
they're using these pre-made DNA building blocks, almost like the movable type used in old printing presses.
So they're like rearranging these existing DNA pieces like a puzzle
Exactly.
to encode the data.
Yep. And they can do it in parallel,
Wow.
meaning they're writing tons of data all at the same time.
So at the same time they're writing
Yeah, they've gotten up to 270,000 bits.
270,000 bits.
All at once with this method.
Wow.
It's like having 270,000 tiny printing presses all working together encoding the data.
It's pretty amazing. No wonder this is such a big deal.
Yeah.
It really feels like we're about to enter a whole new world of data storage.
Right.
And there's this platform I was reading about, the IDNA Drive, which is trying to make this whole process easier to use. What can you tell me about that?
The IDNA Drive platform, which was developed by Zhang and his team, is a really interesting step towards making DNA data storage, something we could all use.
Right.
It's designed with some key advantages.
Okay.
First, it uses that multi-layered approach we were just talking about,
Yeah.
using DNA methylation.
Right.
This means they can pack multiple layers of data into a single DNA template,
Okay.
making it super efficient.
So it's not just like one bit of information per DNA molecule.
Yeah.
It's more like having multiple files within the same DNA strand.
Exactly.
Okay. What else makes the iDNA Drive so innovative?
Well, another thing is that it can make very controlled changes to the data.
Okay.
So using specific chemical reactions, they can target those methylation patterns and basically rewrite the information in the DNA.
Wait, so you're saying we could edit data that's stored in DNA?
Yeah.
That's crazy. The possibilities there are endless.
It really opens up a lot of possibilities.
Absolutely.
And here's where things get even more interesting. They've got this thing called synthesis-free writing with the iDNA Drive. So they use 700 pre-made DNA building blocks.
Oh, wow.
These movable types and 5 DNA templates.
Oh.
And this lets them write something like 270,000 bits without needing to create new DNA strands from scratch.
Right.
Which is a huge cost saver, as we were talking about.
Yeah, so they're basically reusing existing DNA pieces.
Yep.
And rearranging them to make it more cost effective. That's pretty clever.
Yeah, and the whole thing is automated.
Please tell me they're not doing this by hand.
No tweezers and microscopes.
Okay.
It's all automated, and it can write something like 350 bits per reaction.
Wow.
And to make it even better, they can retrieve the data using high-throughput nanopore sequencing.
So break that down for me. What is high-throughput nanopore sequencing?
Imagine a really tiny hole called a nanopore, and you thread a DNA strand through it.
Okay.
As the strand passes through, it makes these unique electrical signals that we can read and decode back to the original data. It's a really powerful way to read DNA sequences quickly and accurately.
So we write the data into DNA with this movable type method, and then we can read it back out using this nanopore sequencing.
Exactly.
It's all very elegant and efficient. Is this the future? Are we all going to have personalized DNA data drives?
It's a pretty cool vision, right?
Yeah.
Storing your whole digital life in DNA.
Right.
But before we get too ahead of ourselves, we should talk about some of the challenges we still have.
Okay, let's do it. So let's talk about cost. I mean, from everything I read, synthesizing DNA for data storage is still super expensive.
Yeah, you're right about that. Right now, the estimate is about $1 trillion per petabyte for DNA synthesis for data storage.
Ah.
To give you a comparison, for that price, you could buy about 4 million top-of-the-line 1 terabyte hard drives.
Okay, so that's definitely not in my budget.
Yeah.
So even though DNA can store a crazy amount of data, the cost is a huge problem right now. What other challenges are researchers working on?
Well, one thing is access times. It's not as fast to get data from DNA as pulling up a file from your hard drive.
Okay.
It takes time. You have to sequence the DNA and then decode that information.
So no instant access to your DNA photo library yet?
Not quite yet, and the encoding and decoding processes are pretty complicated too. They need specialized equipment and expertise.
Right.
We're not at the point where you can plug in your DNA drive and just browse your files.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Our research also mentioned that DNA is sensitive to things in the environment.
Absolutely. DNA is a really fragile molecule. It needs to be stored in a controlled environment so it doesn't break down.
Right.
Especially temperature. That's a big one. If DNA gets too hot, it can get damaged and you could lose data.
So don't leave your DNA data stick in the car on a hot day.
That's a really bad idea. For now, DNA data storage needs a very specific environment, which makes things even more complex and expensive.
Sounds like we have a long way to go before we're all using this technology.
Yeah.
But even with all these challenges, the benefits seem pretty incredible. We've talked about the amazing storage capacity, but what about how long DNA lasts as a storage medium?
That's one of the best things about DNA data storage. It's incredibly stable if you store it properly. We're talking thousands or maybe even millions of years.
Wow, that's like forever. In the digital world, hard drives crash, servers fail, but DNA could outlast them all.
Right.
It's kind of poetic to think about our digital legacy encoded in DNA, the building blocks of life itself. But what about security? Is DNA data vulnerable to hacking?
That's a good question. Any system can be vulnerable, but DNA data is inherently more secure than digital data stored on those traditional servers.
Okay.
To get the data, you would need physical access to the DNA sample and the knowledge to sequence and decode it.
Right.
It's not something someone can easily hack remotely.
So no more data breaches and ransomware attacks. That's a release. And I read that the DNA data storage is also super energy efficient.
Absolutely. Once you encode that data in DNA, it uses very little energy to maintain it.
Right.
Compared to huge data centers that are always running servers and cooling systems, those use a lot of energy.
So it's good for the planet and good for our wallets.
Yep.
It seems like the advantages just keep adding up.
Yeah.
But let's be realistic here. When will this technology actually be available for everyone? Will I be able to back up my vacation photos to a DNA drive someday?
You might have to wait a little longer for that. Researchers think that DNA data storage could be as affordable as magnetic tape, which is used for archiving lots of data in the next 10 or 20 years.
Okay.
But this field is changing so fast. Breakthroughs happen all the time.
Yeah, it's really exciting to think about this becoming something we use every day within our lifetime.
Yeah.
So what are some of the main areas researchers are focusing on to make this happen?
Well, they're working on a lot of different things. They're trying to make parallel writing even better.
Okay.
To speed up the encoding, they're also developing better ways to correct errors to protect the data. And of course, they're looking for faster and cheaper ways to get the information back out of the DNA.
It's pretty amazing to think about all the smart people working on this. It feels like we're watching a whole new era of technology being born.
It does.
The language of life, becoming the language of information. It's fascinating. But before we get too caught up in the future, let's go back and summarize some of the key takeaways from our deep dive into DNA data storage. So we started out talking about encoding digital data into DNA. The building blocks of life and the potential for storage density is just incredible.
Yeah, millions of terabytes in something smaller than a grain of rice.
Right, it's mind-blowing. And then we got into the science behind it, epigenetics and DNA methylation, which is like adding software on top of the existing DNA sequence.
Right, like adding notes to a book.
Exactly, adding another layer of meaning. And then we talked about this really cool movable type printing method where they use pre-made DNA building blocks to rearrange and encode data.
Yeah, it allows for this massive parallel writing, which really speeds up the process.
Yeah, it's super fast. And we can't forget about the IDNA Drive platform. It's a game changer because it uses this movable type approach to store multiple layers of data within a single DNA strand.
Yeah, and the IDNA Drive can write about 270,000 bits of data all at once without having to synthesize new DNA, which really helps with the cost.
Right. It's much more cost effective. And we also learned that they've figured out how to actually edit the data stored in DNA using specific chemical reactions.
It's amazing what they're doing.
It really is. But of course, every new technology has its challenges. Like we talked about, the high cost of DNA synthesis, the slow access times compared to our regular storage, and the need for special equipment and controlled environments.
Right. But the benefits of DNA storage are just too big to ignore. I mean, the fact that DNA can last for thousands or even millions of years as a storage medium is incredible.
Yeah, just imagine preserving our digital history for future generations, a time capsule of knowledge and culture encoded in DNA.
It's a pretty powerful thought.
It really is. And then there's the security aspect. DNA data is so much harder to hack than data on traditional servers.
Yeah, no more worrying about data breaches or ransomware attacks.
And on top of that, it's incredibly energy efficient, which could change how we manage all of this digital data.
Exactly. No more huge data centers using tons of energy.
So it's good for the planet and our wallets. It seems like a win-win. But it makes you wonder, what does this all mean for us? Is this just a science experiment, or will it actually change our lives?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it might be a while before we're all backing up our photos to DNA drives.
Right.
But this technology has the potential to change how we think about information forever.
Absolutely. Imagine a future where we never lose data, where knowledge and memories are passed down for generations with perfect accuracy.
It's a future worth thinking about and exploring.
So that wraps up our deep dive into the world of DNA data storage. We covered a lot today, from the science to the challenges and the amazing possibilities.
And there's still so much more to discover.
It's exactly. This field is constantly evolving. So keep learning, keep asking questions, and let your imaginations run wild. Who knows what breakthroughs are coming next in the world of DNA data storage?